So it's replacing moral discourse with survival logic. Tax policy is a moral conversation. It's based in fairness and burden sharing and legitimacy. But the answer moves to a survival register. You then get sacrifice and necessity and endurance. So it reframes power as maintenance and not authority. Aragon's power flows from legitimacy and renewal. The emperor's flows from constraint and brutal upkeep. And I love this about what he does is he collapses the irony by being too sincere to parody it. On the surface, the claim sounds insane, but it is literal, it's procedural, it's ongoing, and it's non-negotiable. And there's this bit in it. The answer to George R.R. Martin's question, the guy who wrote Game of Thrones, the answer to George R.R. Martin's question, what would Aragorn's tax policy be, is 10,000 psychers sacrificed daily to feed the energy into a corpse of a god emperor holding the line against the forces of hell itself. Now, and again, I'll explain this in a way that you don't need to know anything about 40k to understand what he just did there. But it rejects a category error that Martin is making. So Martin is making a provocation there, and he's assuming that moral or mythical legacy could cash out into procedural governance. That tax policy is modern and technocratic concern, and Aragorn is a pre-modern, king. So asking the question, he's already smuggled in a whole bunch of, liberal bureaucratic assumption about what serious world building means. And he doesn't answer the question, he collapses it. And the point is that it's the wrong axis entirely. He's not saying, I'm going to argue it on this. He just simply changes the frame on it, because Martin's critique of what would Aragorn's tax policy be, what he's trying to imply there is seriousness expressed through administrative plausibility. And he's trying to convey maturity. And he's trying to relay realism through governing mechanisms. And the Warhammer answer is, seriousness is whatever must be done to prevent collapse. And maturity is acknowledging horror without pretending it can be cleaned up. And realism is cost, sacrifice, and a series of irreversible trade-offs, not government mechanics the way that Martin frames it. So 10,000 psychers a day, it's obscene and it's monstrous and it's irrational by liberal standards. And that's precisely why it's honest within its own metaphysics. It admits the true price of holding the line. And it exposes the moral asymmetry, really, between worlds. So in the Tolkien and even the Martin discourse, evil is episodic. It's occasional. It's external and it's defeatable. But in the 40k world, evil is ambient and metaphysical and it's permanent. Which of those sounds more like our world? When do the evils ever go away? When do you win? How many times in history before have we thought that we've won? And dealing with degeneracy and leftism, all of the things that it is embodied in the left that we explicitly reject, how many times have we won out over them in whatever form, going back however far you want to go back in history, only to find it comes back? So once you accept that frame, governance stops being about justice and starts being about containment. And the Imperium it isn't trying to be good, it's trying to prevent annihilation. And the psychers are not a policy choice, they're a structural necessity. And actually, Carl made this point quite well in a tweet where he referenced this. I forget what the fallback was, but somebody was saying, yeah, but we don't actually sacrifice 1,000 psychers a day, do we? And Carl was like, okay, we actually do sacrifice 1,000 people a day. In the Western world, we easily sacrifice 1,000 people a day. We do. And we don't acknowledge it. So while most people are reading 40k as sort of satire or fascistic or bureaucratic, what he's doing in that line is he's reframing it as something colder and more disturbing. A world where satire has failed because the emergency never ends. Again, how does that relate cleanly to the world that we're living in? So the horror isn't that the Imperium is sacrificing psychers. The horror is given the premise that they are right to do so. What that's doing is it functions as a compressed thesis in a statement. So in one sentence, he's communicating a whole bunch of brilliant points. If he said, "What about tax policy?" that would be a shallow critique. And it's not a joke line. It's a philosophical answer disguised as one. And the reason it lands so hard is because it forces the reader to confront an uncomfortable possibility that many of the modern demands that we have for seriousness or realism and good governance are all luxuries of a world that believes that the foundational layer of those civilizations are still intact. And what he's using Warhammer to describe is imagine they aren't, and then answer honestly. So my first reading of this is that he's rejecting the posture of managerialism in favour of doing whatever is necessary to survive. But actually, it goes much deeper than that, doesn't it? Because managerialism versus survival, that's only the outer layer of this. So let's start to peel it a bit, shall we? He annihilates the policy frame entirely. Because managerialism, it assumes a number of things, that the system is stable, that problems are solvable, that trade-offs are reversible, and that legitimacy precedes action. But the completed line says that none of this is true. It's not policy, it's maintenance of existence. Tax policy makes a number of assumptions: continuity and surplus and time and moral optionality. And the Imperium, which is why he picks this as a subject to talk about, has none of these, and they're honest about it. The next thing I'd say is that it replaces legitimacy with necessity. So in the liberal mindset, legitimacy leads to authority, and then that leads to action. But in 40k, necessity leads to action and retroactive justification. And again, which of those is closer to the world that we actually live in? And in 40k, the emperor is a corpse. There's no charismatic ruler. There's no living sovereign. There's no contest. Power has persisted without legitimacy because the alternative is extinction. And again, apply that back to the modern world. Democracy is a corpse. There's no charismatic ruler. There's no sovereign. Or sovereignty has been removed from the people. And power persists without legitimacy because the alternative is the extinction of the liberal world order. Again, it's a brilliant inversion of the frame. What else does he do with that line? He reintroduces metaphysics, where modernity has explicitly tried to delete it. So Martin's question smuggles in, a post-Enlightenment assumption that politics is administration over material conditions. And he's saying, no, politics is downstream of metaphysical war. And the bit about hell itself is doing real work here, because in 40k, chaos is not a metaphor or an ideology, it's an active force. And once that's true, the whole Enlightenment settlement, it just collapses. And it turns sacrifice, something we're of course allergic to these days. Well, people can be involuntarily sacrificed. Women and children can be sacrificed in the Western world, but to make a sacrifice, that is discouraged. It turns sacrifice from a moral failure into a structural requirement. So the modern ethic is, let's treat sacrifices as tragic and avoidable and evidence of failure, whereas 40k treats sacrifice as baseline and unavoidable, and evidence that the universe itself is hostile. And this is why the line is so disturbing in a way that satire doesn't. It doesn't say, look how evil this is. What it is instead asking is, what is the price? And that's why it resonates with us, because we live in a world that still demands sacrifice, but pretends it doesn't. And the Warhammer framing simply removes the lie. What else does it? It reframes belief itself. You've got this empire with the dead emperor propped up on the throne, and yet the sacrifice continues. So belief is no longer about truth, and belief is about function. And faith is instrumental, and it's not epistemic. And that is postmodernism after disbelief, after irony, after deconstruction. And what remains is basically operational faith. And we do this because it stops breaking the world. Now, if he had written managerial liberalism fails in civilizational emergencies or something like that, it would be a pretty banal line. Instead, he inverts your view to show a universe that is at a permanent state of emergency, where administrators have been replaced by sacrifice, and the budget has been replaced by a corpse on life support, and hell is not a metaphor. So the line that he's saying there is not Warhammer is more realistic than Tolkien. What it's saying is that in the Tolkien and Martin world, they assume the world can be healed. And the Warhammer world assumes it can only be held together and at a cost. So once you accept that premise, asking about tax policy isn't just shallow, it's insane. So this is I think this article is one of those rare moments where genre fiction is doing first order political theology, while most political commentary is stuck at second order administration. And the article lands because it's an articulation of something that they can feel but can't yet name. The sense that we move from one governing society into maintaining a failing reality. And that's kind of where I want to go next week, with reinverting the frame of how does power actually work in the the Western political system. It's a series of managing risk. I'm fairly convinced of that now. So let me just read it again, because I want to pick it. I want to pick it apart a little bit more. Read the line. The answer to George R. R. Martin's question, what would Aragorn's tax policy be, is 10,000 psychers sacrificed daily to feed energy into the corpse of a god emperor holding the line against the forces of hell itself. Let's just look at that one more time. So Martin's question assumes that the world is governable and that institutions are stable and that problems are solvable, and that time horizons are going to be long enough for policy to matter. And that is perceived as realism. Managerial realism is plausible procedures. Warhammer's realism is unavoidable cost. Absolutely something we have lost sight of in the modern world. So it's replacing moral discourse with survival logic. Tax policy is a moral conversation. It's based in fairness and burden sharing and legitimacy. But the answer moves to a survival register. You then get sacrifice and necessity and endurance. So it reframes power as maintenance and not authority. Aragorn's power flows from legitimacy and renewal. The Emperor's flows from constraint and brutal upkeep. And I love this about what he does, is he collapses the irony by being too sincere to parody it. On the surface, the claim sounds insane, but it is literal, it's procedural, it's ongoing, and it's non-negotiable. So effectively, he's answering a literary critique with political theology. Not in a not in a real, in a religious sense, but in the sense of, okay, what is it that does sustain order? What is power for? And what happens when God is dead but must still function? And it resonates because it mirrors our moment without allegory. You read that and you think, institutions persist without belief. Check. Systems demand sacrifice without meaning. Check. Catastrophe is deferred and not solved. Definite check. What he's doing is he's answering the wrong question with the right truth. The genius is not that he says, I don't know, Aragon wouldn't have a tax policy. What it says is, it's insane to ask that question at all. Asking that question means that you don't understand what is happening. And that's not a rebuttal, but it's a diagnosis. Before I move on, I also want to talk about the technique that he's using, because I also think that the technique itself is subtly brilliant. And I mean, you've got to bear in mind that Morgoth is he's almost the very definition of salt of the earth. I don't think he's well educated. I mean, not formally educated anyway. I'm not digging at the guy. I'm just saying that he is self-taught. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he, quit school before A levels or something like that. I mean, I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. So what that means is he's using these tools intuitively, and he's not deploying them based on theory in the academic sense. He's using them in a very specific and powerful toolkit, and it's intuitive and it's not formal. So I wanted to go below through the techniques that he's using and describing them functionally rather than in credential terms. So first thing, he goes straight for frame inversion. He rarely argues within a frame, and this is one of the key things that I learned from this, and one of the key abilities that unlocked in me is don't argue within the frame. Change the frame so completely that the original question becomes incoherent. Because Martin there was asking a policy question, and the response moves immediately to ontology. What kind of world is this? And that's not a rebuttal, it's a frame invalidation. And this is a really high level technique because it avoids point scoring, and instead it forces the reader to renegotiate the premise on which they're having the discussion. And most writers will never do this because they're trained to respond. He doesn't, he resituates. Second thing he does, category collapse. He deliberately answers the question in the wrong category. Policy to sacrifice, governance to ritual, legitimacy to necessity. And what that does in readers, it creates a cognitive shock. Not confusion. The reader can immediately sense that something deeper has been exposed. And actually, this is a fairly classic move in philosophy and theology, but he's doing it here narratively and rhetorically, which makes it very accessible. The third technique that he's using is metaphysical literalism. He treats metaphysical claims as operationally real. Hell exists, therefore policy logic fails. Chaos is real, therefore sacrifice is fuel. And most writers will instinctively hedge metaphysics as symbolism. He doesn't, he commits to it. And that gives the prose weight. The readers feel the consequences rather than being told about them. It certainly doesn't read like he's trying to be clever. It just reads as inevitable. Next technique he's using, scale juxtaposition. So he puts radically mismatched scales next to each other. Tax policy is small and it's technocratic and it's procedural. 10,000 psychers daily is vast, violent and cosmic. And that contrast does a lot of intellectual work without needing to be explained. the reader feels the absurdity of one next to the other. And this is actually a poet's technique most commonly. And here it's being used for analytical ends. What next does he do? He does moral compression. So he compresses an entire ethical system into a single image. Legitimacy being replaced by the sacrifice. Governance by feeding energy and decay. So that completely bypasses, the standard discursive ethics and goes straight to the moral institutions. And the reader doesn't reason first, they recognise first. And that's why it sticks. Next, he refuses to console the reader. He never reassures the reader that this is ironic or exaggerated, or that this is temporary, or this is solvable. And most writers, when they're writing, they try and soften the blow. The refusal signifies in some way seriousness. And readers, they feel, are going to trust that as serious. But he doesn't do that. Doesn't soften. And that's rare because it's actually quite psychologically expensive to think and write in that mode. But he does it. Next technique he employs is operational thinking disguised as myth. So even though it looks mythical, the thinking is operational. What keeps the system running? What happens if we stop? What costs cannot be avoided? And that's system thinking, not literary flourish. He's asking, what is load bearing? And then he's answering honestly. And this is why, despite the enormity, the writing feels grounded. Plus, he's doing a whole bunch of audience elevation. He does not explain himself defensively. And he's assuming that you, the reader, can hold multiple frames in your head, that you can tolerate discomfort, and that you can follow an unstable inference. And that pulls the reader up. It's a signal of respect to the reader. And sophisticated readers are going to respond strongly to it. And most writers are trained to build scaffolds around their work. He just trusts you. There's also a bit of post-ironic sincerity going in there. He uses extreme imagery without winking at it. And that's kind of crucial because once irony collapses, only sincerity remains. And since sincerity under horror is the rarest tone in contemporary writing, it works. And the tone can't be faked. It emerges when somebody has thought something through far enough that irony feels dishonest, really. So why has this emerged so cleanly? All of these multiple, fairly high-end writing techniques, why have they all emerged so cleanly in a self-taught mind? Well, I suppose it's because formally educated writers often inherit frames that they've never really interrogated, and they optimize for peer legibility, and they avoid the ontological claims. Whereas self-taught thinkers like Morgoth, they build from first principles, and they test those ideas against lived intuition. So they care less about category hygiene. They just don't care about that. So effectively, why does it work so well? It's because he's not missing tools. He's just shown that you can deploy 9 or 10 high-level tools in a sophisticated manner. It's not working because he lacks tools. It's working because he lacks constraints. He didn't go through the formal academic process, and so the constraints were never built in. He understood these from first principles, as opposed to reading about theory and then trying to apply it without having taken the time to think through properly, how did I get here? So, yeah, bloody brilliant article. Bloody brilliant. By Islander. Wonderful. If you enjoyed that content, and of course you did because you are a smart person, then why don't you go over to lotuseaters.com where you can watch the whole episode for as little as £5 a month, which really is not much money at all, and you get loads of really good content.